once appeared before a middle school group with my friend Stephen King, the other King from Maine. And a little girl raised her hand and said, "Do you ever have nightmares?" And Stephen King's response was, "No, I give them to you." That's my job today, to give you a nightmare about the vulnerability of our water systems. This is an extremely dangerous situation. I believe that the next Pearl Harbor, the next 9/11, will be cyber. And we are facing a vulnerability in all of our systems, but water is one of the most critical and I think one of the most vulnerable, and that's why Mike Gallagher and I thought it was important to come and talk to you today. We have to reimagine conflict. For 1,000 years, we've thought of conflict and wars as army against army, navy against navy, battles out in some other place. Conflict now is almost entirely in the cyberspace area, focused on the private sector, on non-combatants, if you will. And that's why we're in a different way of thinking about this kind of issue. And we have to think about a new relationship between the government, particularly the federal government, and the private sector. 85% of the target in cyberspace are in the private sector. In this country, I was on a panel recently with Kevin Mandia, who's one of the real private sector experts. He's the head of Firewire, the guy who really discovered the solar winds attack. He said we live in a cyber glass house in this country. We're the most wired country in the world. That's good. But we're also the most vulnerable country in the world. North Korea, I don't think, has to worry too much about cyber attacks because they don't have much in the way of connectivity. Everything in this country is connected, and water is a target. As Representative Gallagher just mentioned, we know of attacks in Florida, in California, in Kansas. There was a serious one in Israel recently. And wherever there is an automated system for controlling chemical flow, which there is in virtually all water systems, there's a vulnerability. Our adversaries, be they criminal syndicates or nation states, are never at rest. And Chairman Carper, in his opening statement, talked about how this has to be a sustained effort. There's no single solution. We've got to continue to up our game because our adversaries are upping their game. In terms of the water systems, we have good news and bad news. The good news is our systems are fragmented and scattered. In other words, it's not like the electric grid where an adversary could take down a whole region of the country. The bad news is because they're so fragmented, 70,000 of them, rarely do they have the wherewithal or the knowledge to fully protect themselves so they can be picked off one at a time more easily than the grid, which has a high level of protection and a high level of sophistication. The ranking member knows all about what can happen when a water system goes bad, as it did in Charleston some years ago. It wasn't a cyber attack, but it was a kind of warning of what this can mean and how serious it can be for a community. So what are the solutions? I should mention that our commission worked, we're still at work. We had our appalling 44th meeting this past Monday, so we're still at it trying to define what the solutions are. There are federal solutions in terms of organization. We just appointed our first national cyber director 2 weeks ago. There are a lot of those things that are going on, but in an area like this, protection begins at the desktop. We could do everything right here in Washington, and goodness knows we don't, but we could, but still be vulnerable if one official in one desk in Dubuque in the water office clicks on a phishing email, then we're sunk. And that's the danger. So there has to be a system of tech support through the Department of Agriculture, through your programs, tech support for these programs. There have to be standards, and there has to be testing. There has to be somebody who, if I were running a water system, I would hire an outside group to try to hack me to show whether or not I'm vulnerable. Most CIOs say, yeah, boss, we're okay. I don't think we are. And the only way to determine that is by what's called penetration testing, which is actually hackers for hire, friendly hackers to determine where your vulnerability lies. We need to talk about systemically important critical infrastructure and setting up an environment. In our report, we call it a joint collaborative environment where the private sector and the government can share information in real time with confidence and trust that will enable us to bring to bear the resources of the federal government and also to allow the private sector to have some liability protection if they're going to share information and have this relationship, because a week later doesn't work. So to go back to the beginning, there is an incipient nightmare here, and it involves all sectors of our critical infrastructure, but water, I think, is probably the most vulnerable because of the dispersed nature of water systems in the country. So I commend this committee for attending to this issue. Look forward to working with you as we try to work through the solutions and to have our game at the level of our adversaries. This is a potential nightmare, but it's one that we can wake up from if indeed we wake up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.